going to introduce us to a New Testament scholar who might be wrestling with the same thing, similar sort of stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. So I thought I'd do show and tell, because why not? So I've grabbed a couple of books from my shelves. This is, well, I'm going to say more about them in a minute, but this is a first edition with a dust jacket of George Beasley Murray's commentary on the Book of Revelation. So you pass it around, if you get bored with me, have a look at those. But I will have them back at the end, please. When I was in my early 20s and an undergraduate reading biblical studies at Sheffield, I attended Cemetery Road Baptist Church. The minister at the time was Chris Ellis. And I was part of the pastoral team. And one of the old men that I visited was the Reverend Warwick Bailey. He was then in his 90s, but still preaching occasionally. I remember him preaching, I think, the Sunday before he died. He told me of a time in the early 1930s when, as a young minister himself, not long out of Spurgeon's College, he had had a couple of students from Spurgeon's come to visit his church in Leicester to lead a mission. And the event was deemed a failure. There was only one young man converted and baptised in the whole mission, and that teenager was George Beasley Murray. I have since corroborated this story with Paul Beasley Murray, and actually I found a very similar version of it to the one that Warwick gave me in Paul's memoir of his father. A decade or so later, when I was in my early 30s, I was in an interview for a job. And one of the interview questions was to ask me which George's approach I preferred to the Book of Revelation, that of George Caird or George Beasley Murray. I can't quite remember how I answered, but I suspect I tried to pay tribute to the distinct and valuable insights offered by each without overcommitting myself from memory as to precisely what those distinctives might actually be. Anyway, I got the job. But in case you're wondering, so G.B. Caird published his Black's New Testament commentary in the mid-60s, while G.R. Beasley Murray published 3 contributions to the study of the Book of Revelation in the early 70s, starting with his section in the IVP New Bible Commentary, published in 1970. I do have a copy of this at home. I got it out and had a look at it in preparation for this, and when I opened it up, I found in the front that it was a Sunday school prize given to my wife, and it somehow found its way into my study, as is the way of these things. Anyway, followed by the short book that you've got there entitled Highlights of the Book of Revelation, published in 1972, and then his magnum opus, New Century Bible Commentary on Revelation in 1974. So in honour of the 50th anniversary of this landmark publication, my intent today is to, just for a few minutes, highlight something of Beasley Murray's distinctive contribution to the study of the Book of Revelation and reflect on his ongoing significance for Baptist biblical scholarship. A longer version of this paper would have more direct interaction with the text of the commentary, but that's for another time. To return to the question of the 2 Georges for a moment, George Caird, a Congregationalist biblical scholar, had established his academic reputation on the basis of his socio-historical approach to the Book of Revelation, by examining political, religious and cultural environment of the first century Roman Empire. Caird aimed to shed light on the meaning and significance of the symbols and events described in the book. George Beasley Murray, a Baptist minister with a distinguished academic career which included 15 years as principal of Spurgeon's College in London from 58 to 73, he differed to Caird's approach by particularly emphasising the theological significance of the Book of Revelation. And by this he meant not just an examination of the theology of John the author, but also how John's theological perspective could shape the theology of those reading the biblical text. In his introduction to the commentary, he says that the reader must correctly grasp the genres of the text in order to properly, and I quote here, properly grasp its message in the way John wished it to be understood, and that Revelation must be read as part of the wider Christian canon, quote, if we are to gain a mature understanding of the Christian faith. So you can see the theological concerns that he's drawing out there. And through his commentary, Beasley Murray focuses on drawing out these central theological concerns within the text, highlighting how John uses imagery and symbolism to convey theological truth. He engaged with the historical critical method, and he makes his own contribution to it, particularly in his acknowledgement of the presence of pagan mythological and astrological elements in the book. But even here, where he does this, he argues that John is incorporating these elements always to support his theological purposes. In the first ever issue of the evangelical journal Themelios, also published in 1974, Richard Borkham wrote a review of Beasley Murray's commentary. And Borkham spends much of his review quibbling with specific aspects of Beasley Murray's interpretation, before concluding rather more generously, "Nevertheless, this is a very fine commentary, notably sensitive to the functions of apocalyptic imagery and appreciative of the apocalypse's very weighty theological contribution. Asked as I often am," goes on Borkham, "asked as I often am to recommend a commentary on Revelation, I would now choose Beasley Murray without hesitation." High praise indeed, of course, from a scholar who 20 years later would himself go on to revolutionise the study of the apocalypse. It's worth considering Borkham's review rather carefully, because it allows us to hear how Beasley Murray's commentary was received within the Academy at the time of its publication. And this matters for us because, despite his obvious academic abilities, Beasley Murray's published scholarship was often written rather more with an eye on the church than it was on the Academy, and more particularly on the more conservative evangelical end of Baptist churchmanship. In 1973, as his commentary on Revelation was nearing publication, he moved from Spurgeon's College to become, as the inside cover of the book proudly proclaims, Professor of New Testament Interpretation at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and he was there from 73 to 80. And in his 1972 shorter volume that you've got there, Highlights of the Book of Revelation, this was an expanded version of some lectures delivered at the Nationwide Bible Conference organised by the Sunday School Board of the Southern Baptist Convention held in Dallas, Texas in 1971. So you get an idea of who he's engaging with at the point where he's doing this scholarship. On the back cover of the American imprint of the Highlights book, Beasley Murray comments, "I became interested in the subject of the Lord's second advent when a young minister in London during the early years of World War II. He continues, "Naturally, my study included the Book of Revelation." In fact, Beasley Murray's first foray into publishing on the apocalypse came as early as 1951, with an article in the Evangelical Quarterly entitled "The Second Coming in the Book of Revelation." And he concludes this article by observing that, and this is a quote, "One would have thought that the experiences of the 20th century church would have confirmed to the full that conviction of the inspired seer, judgment and sovereignty, the fulfillment and purpose of God, are what the prophet means by the second coming of Christ. If that be felt by some theologians to be trivial, we must leave them to their own imaginings. For us, it is revelation, the revelation, given to his servant John by the angel of God's anointed." That's 1951. And it's easy to see how his experiences as a wartime pastor in London were influencing his theological reading of Revelation, with themes such as judgment and sovereignty coming out in that. The interplay that he draws between theological insight and biblical interpretation is echoed in another article published later that same year, 1951 again, this time published by Spurgeon's College, based on an address he had given to the Baptist Union Assembly. And this one's entitled "The Second Coming of Christ." That's 1951. Beasley Murray's intended audience for his scholarship was, it seems, always primarily pastors and seminarians. So to return to Borkham's review for a moment. He praises Beasley Murray's broad acquaintance, this is quoting from Borkham, broad acquaintance with Jewish apocalyptic literature, and his striking discussions of John's allusions to pagan and astrological concepts, noting that Beasley Murray shows how these are used by John to, quote, further his central theological purposes. Borkham goes on to comment that probably the aspect of John's work which emerges with greater clarity here than in any previous study is his representation of Christ as the fulfilment of both Jewish hopes of messianic deliverance and the highest aspirations of contemporary paganism. And it's in this adaptation of Jewish and pagan sources to the concerns of those in the congregations of the 7 churches of Asia Minor that Beasley Murray finds John's theology. And Borkham notes that this principle effectively controls his estimate of the eschatological perspective of the book, a combination of preterism and futurism that Borkham rather underwhelmingly describes as usually convincing. Oh God, I hope Borkham never reviews me. Anyway, Borkham, however, notes approvingly that Beasley Murray's rejection of the excesses of source-critical approaches, resulting in a conviction that the book as we have it is a consistent and carefully constructed unity. However, Borkham notes an inconsistency in Beasley Murray's approach to certain sections, where the commentary suggests that oracles or visions were adopted with minimal adaptation. Borkham wants to go further, suggesting that in the case of a writer of such careful literary artistry as John, it is a strange counsel of despair to argue with Beasley Murray that John used sources which can be detected because they do not quite say what John would have said were he writing the passage himself. And I think here we can begin to trace his critique of Beasley Murray. And trace in this the beginnings of Borkham's own distinctively theological approach to the book of Revelation. I mean, one of his great books is that short little black book, The Theology of the Book of Revelation, in which he emphasises the text's theological significance within the context of first century Christianity. And I did kind of wonder if Borkham was sort of shaping what his approach would be in the way he was being a bit sniffy about Beasley Murray. But that is a story for another day. Back to Beasley Murray. In reflecting on the ongoing significance of Beasley Murray's contribution and his commentary, I want to return to the assertion I made earlier that it is both academic and theological. In other words, it's written in dialogue with the insights of the academy and particularly the historical critical method. But it is written for people of faith who expect their biblical scholarship to speak of their relationship with God. It's worth remembering that Beasley Murray's primary academic context was 2 seminaries, Spurgeon's and Southern, and these settings may have allowed him to teach and research in a different way to what one might expect from a more secular university setting. It's my contention that Beasley Murray stood at what we might call the parting of the ways, to borrow Jimmy Dunn's phrase, to describe the pulling apart of Christianity from Judaism. Through the mid-20th century, something of a divide began to emerge within British biblical scholarship between those who wrote for an ecclesial audience and those who wrote for an academic audience. And I think this is building on what Debs was talking about, which situates in that midpoint in the 20th century. Now, some people, of course, did both, and some people still try to. Rarely successfully both things at the same time, though. For example, it became increasingly unusual for a commentary written from an overtly faith-based perspective to make a significant academic contribution to the field of biblical studies, with the task of the preaching pastor or faith-facing scholar often being that of taking the insights of the academy and applying them to the pastoral needs of the churches they serve. One might even suggest that the task of the Christian exegete became analogous to what Beasley Murray identified as John's task in the book of Revelation, that of adopting the available source material and adapting it to a contextualized ecclesial context. So if the academy looks to the literary context and the church looks to God, can the two ever meet? Well, Beasley Murray set himself the task, and I do think he largely achieved it, of writing a commentary that is both theological and academic. His scholarship has stood the test of time, and the appreciation of his work by those in the churches that he served continues. The parting of the ways was already visible by the 1960s, and certainly I think that's in the background to what Beasley Murray is trying to do in his commentary. The parting of the ways may have begun earlier, even amongst Baptists. Slight segue for a moment here. It's interesting to compare the 1942 Festschrift for Wheeler Robinson, edited by Ernest Payne, with the 1964 Festschrift presented to Dr. Dakin, edited by Len Champion. Wheeler Robinson's earlier volume was entitled Studies in History and Religion, while Dr. Dakin's later volume was entitled The Communication of the Christian Faith. It's clear even from the titles that there's something going on there. And if you look at the essays in the former, the earlier volume, the Wheeler Robinson volume, from that in the 1940s, the interests of the Baptist contributors there were highly sympathetic to what's often called higher criticism, including issues such as the dating of Deuteronomy, the limitations of German form criticism, and an essay by Townley Lord, one of my predecessors at Bloomsbury, on the importance of the body in conceiving of a person's body-soul unity. One reviewer of this volume commented, "When one thinks of the horror with which the higher criticism was regarded in most earnest evangelical circles 2 generations ago, it is a sign of the times to find these representative Baptist ministers today handling critical theories with complete familiarity and confidence." That's 1942. By contrast, the volume from the 1960s focuses much more on faith-facing issues of clearer direct relevance to those in pastoral ministry, such as the relationship of the Bible to creeds, what evangelical faith might mean today, and communicating the Christian faith through pastoral care and mass media. It seems there was a shift underway during this period, away from Baptist ministers engaging in historical critical biblical studies, towards them addressing more directly the pastoral contexts and needs of their audience. And I think it's instructive to situate Beasley Murray within this trajectory. Indeed, in the foreword to Beasley Murray's short book Christ is Alive, published in 1947, he gets his friend F.F. Bruce to write the foreword. And F.F. Bruce says that it is not a work of scholarship in the strictest sense. I mean, you sometimes wonder with Beasley Murray whether his friends really liked what he did. But anyway, F.F. Bruce says in the foreword to the book, this is not a work of scholarship in the strictest sense, though he does go on to note that there is, quote, well-informed scholarship which underlies it. And Bruce goes on to say of Beasley Murray that the author is a true scholar, and yet not in spite of his scholarship, as some might say, but because of it. He maintains that there is quite exceptionally good ground for accepting the Christian postulates. It seems that much of Beasley Murray's work through the years was engaged in seeking to communicate the faith, to borrow the title for the Dakin volume, using his academic skills to validate his faith convictions, and to this end he often, for example, published lectures in book form. So there's an interesting question to be asked here as to where to situate a book such as his commentary on the Book of Revelation. Is it academic or biblical scholarship? Is it devotional biblical exegesis? And I think it does certainly tick both of those boxes. I want to suggest there's a third category that might enfold both of these. I think it's apologetics. I think it is the defence and rational justification of the Christian faith. Beasley Murray using all the skills at his disposal, both scholarly and pastoral, to present the Christian faith in ways that would draw people in to the life of faith that he himself had been drawn into as a teenager. Beasley Murray himself commented in 1986 that leading members of other denominations do not expect to hear anything profound from a Baptist and are surprised when they do. Our stock, he says, is pretty low. He continues, there is cause for this judgment upon us, and it must be plainly faced. It is the theological shallowness of much of our preaching and the ignorance of many of our members. And at a conference on Baptists and biblical scholarship, I find myself wondering what Beasley Murray would say to us. It is, of course, impossible to know, but it is interesting at this point, I think, to consider Beasley Murray's response to the Michael Taylor controversy in 1971, the period within which his commentary on the Book of Revelation was under preparation. So seriously did he take this issue that he resigned as chair of Baptist Union Council in order to be able to speak freely to the debate. And he published his response in 1972 as a little booklet, The Christological Controversy in the Baptist Union. And according to Leon Macbeth, who taught at Southwestern Seminary, Beasley Murray cautions that Michael Taylor's views undercut Baptist theology, as well as the worship of Christ, hymns about Christ, and baptism and the Lord's Supper. At the Baptist Assembly in 1972, Beasley Murray seconded a resolution from Baptist Union Council, calling for, quote, the wholehearted acceptance of and belief in the Baptist Union Declaration of Principle set out in the Union's constitution as the basis on which the denomination could go forward united in the work and extension of Christ's kingdom. J.J. Brown commented that Beasley Murray maintains that faith and freedom should be held in creative tension. It seems to me that the interplay of academic and theological concerns that we see in George Beasley Murray's commentary on Revelation and in the wider context of his writings and churchmanship continue to pose a prescient challenge to the contemporary task of being a Baptist biblical scholar. And perhaps it's best to give the last word to George himself from the introduction to his commentary. And as he describes what he sees as John of Patmos's approach, I find myself wondering if he also sees this as an echo or a precursor to his own calling. Here's this from the introduction. John's adoption of the style of an apocalypticist in no way hinders him from thinking as a prophet. Most of John's work, even its highly apocalyptic passages, consist of a series of prophet-like oracles. From the standpoint of our present interest, it is to be observed that while the imagery in many of these passages is luxuriant, the events so symbolised are seen as in a glass darkly. All we can gather is that the Lord will come and act in sovereign power to judge and reign. Whoever maintains that the Revelation was written to satisfy curiosity has not really pondered the book, and one who seeks to compile from it a history in advance will either be disappointed or deceived, for it's not there to be written. John's visions of the end are those of an impressionist artist rather than the pictures of a photographer. For the most part, they defy precision in application, but they convey sufficient to warn humans of the end of state idolatry, and enough about the kingdom of God to encourage them to faith and adoration of God. Amen.